Skyward Sword. It's almost like a dirty word amongst the Zelda community. The most polarizing entry in the series, as well as the earliest playable section of the canonical timeline. It attracted a lot of flack upon release for a number of reasons. Namely, its ever-present motion controls, more linear approach to exploration, as well as the patronizing existence of Fi, whose whole personality is defined by pointing out the obvious all the time. But beneath all that, many still recognized a brilliant masterpiece that deserved a second chance. Nintendo heard those calls, and now we have Skyward Sword HD. But just how well can this remake smooth out the wrinkles in Skyward Sword's legacy? Find out in this review. Before you do, however, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell for notifications whenever I upload, leave a like, as well as commenting your thoughts on Skyward Sword before watching. Let's get into it. The game begins with the legend of the three goddesses who created the Triforce, as well as the land at this point simply referred to as the Surface. Meanwhile, the villainous Demon King Demise sought to take ownership of this power. With his army of monster henchmen, he led a massive assault against the inhabitants of the Surface. After a lot of bloodshed, the goddess decided to send her favorite race, it's weird, I'm not debating that, the humans, up on a floating chunk of land which then becomes Skyloft. Then, she took the rest of the surface dwellers into battle and drove back Demise's army. Over generations, the humans' ears got pointier, and the existence of the surface faded into legend. One lengthy and romantic tension-laden tutorial sequence later, Link finds his way down to the surface to rescue his childhood friend Zelda from an unknown force. There's no denying that this opening is, and always has been, tedious. But it does set up a colourful ensemble of recurring characters as well as their arcs. This is only aided by a cinematic feel that builds upon what worked in the cutscenes of Twilight Princess. Link and Zelda's connection stemming from growing up together is really nifty, and it helps a lot of what happens later in the game to actually resonate more than it would, if they just met a few hours into the game. I love a lot of the characters here, and that of course includes the infamous Groose. He does get a little overhyped by the Zelda fandom, but ultimately he's still a lovable rapscallion who we deserve to see more of in, hopefully, a future Zelda game. The main villain, Girahim, is like a bisexual sleep paralysis demon, and he walks this perfect tightrope between chivalrous and terrifying. As the plot unfolds, there is this really stop-start kind of idea of pacing, and that hasn't really been rectified in the HD version, though it does build towards a satisfying and really intense conclusion. Now, the second I got control of Link in this game, my first thought was, holy shit, you can actually rotate the camera now! That's because the Switch's far more traditional control scheme offers a second joystick that was not present with the Wii version. The game isn't really built with this feature in mind, but it does help bring it closer in feel to other 3D Zelda games. The big thing here is the sword controls. This time around, Nintendo offered the option to play with the classic motion controls as well as with the newly implemented purely button experience. Since swinging the sword and using items here relies heavily on this, it's important to nail both of these schemes, and honestly they did a great job of this. The Joy-Cons feel noticeably more precise than the Wii Remote ever did, however they still can be pretty bad at points, particularly when you try to activate that Skyward Strike. Besides these, those first few hours can be a little difficult, but once you reach the part where the enemies have electric swords, trust me, you're gonna learn in leaps and bounds, out of necessity. There's still moments where stuff like the 4-directional lock puzzles just won't work how they're supposed to, or you try to perform a horizontal slice and end up doing a diagonal one, but when they work, I would not hesitate to call them groundbreaking. But not every implementation of this feature stood the test of time. Like the menus having shoehorned in motion controls, yeah, that's pretty tacky. The newly implemented option to use a button control scheme is an interesting one. It's a little tricky at first, but for the most part, it offers up much the same experience as the original scheme. The right stick controlling the sword means that the only way to move the camera is to hold the right trigger while using it. It's slightly disjointed, but not the worst thing. Similarly, moves like the spin attack are a little weird to execute because you have to enter an almost fighting game-like input of stick presses. It also works well for flying around, and there's also an inversion option for this, which for me was preferable. If you have the option, I'd still recommend the motion controls, but this option is great for handheld gameplay, or just people who for one reason or another don't have the required mobility. The majority of Skyward Sword's gameplay can be broken down into 3 distinct formats. You have the sky portions, the surface portions, and Zelda's bread and butter, the dungeons. I'll start by discussing the sky and then come around to the other 2. The central hub of the sky and the world as a whole is Skyloft. This is Link's hometown, and it's a place where you'll be spending a lot of time. There's a lot to do here, and its incredibly fleshed out set of characters and locales is rivaled only by Majora's Mask's Clock Town. Areas like Beetle's Airshop and the Marketplace offer heaps of collectibles, potions, upgrades to your items, and more, and there really is something so satisfying about coming back here incrementally to upgrade items or buy heart pieces and such. There's always new quests and areas to explore here, but interacting with its characters is the best aspect in my opinion. The Gratitude Crystal side quest really keeps Skyloft compelling as a place to return to, and exploring it at nighttime is just a whole other experience. Characters you thought you had the full picture of are actually very different when they clock off from work, and seeing this just makes them feel all the more human. I really do have nothing but praise for Skyloft, but this is only a small section of the game's expansive sky. The first time you dive into the clouds and summon your Loftwing, you feel like king shit. The thing controls like a real bird because you're flapping with the Joy-Con, there's this adventurous orchestrated song playing, and there's this gigantic sky filled with islands out there for you to explore. But at some point, your outlook on all these things changes. Flapping your Joy-Con starts to hurt your hand. That orchestrated song plays on a loop and loses what made it great. The big sky starts to just feel really empty, and all those little islands, for the most part, they're just places to put chests that you can't even open until later in the game. And granted, finding all these associated goddess cubes on the surface and unlocking the chests is fun, as is the link it creates between the surface and sky, but ultimately it does end up feeling more like busy work than any sort of real puzzle or gameplay challenge. The place you'll spend the bulk of your time here is the surface. The mystery surrounding it would lead you to believe that it's one of the best designed worlds in Zelda. But after exploring it, you'll realize that it's actually just a collection of 3 fairly linear regions that you keep coming back to 3 times each just to complete the main story. In this post-Breath of the Wild era, it's easy to forget that Zelda games used to feature much more linear world design, but even prior to that, I've always found this to be extra linear when comparing it to predecessors like Wind Waker or Twilight Princess. It's not entirely a bad thing, but sometimes the areas that lead to the actual dungeons in themselves end up feeling almost like dungeons. Within this framework though, the areas actually manage to pack in lots of well thought out environmental puzzles, enemies to fight, and charming local residents. The game does, however, drag due to going back to these same areas several times for the main story. Yeah, I understand that 3 is an important motif in Zelda, but this still felt a little lazy and padded out to me. In spite of that, there's still a good amount of fun to have in some of these return visits. Each region has newly accessible locations to traverse when you come back, and some of these, like Lake Floria or the Sand Sea, are actually really great expansions on already decent areas. I also like that as you unlock certain items with the dowsing mechanic, you can track them down in places you previously would have just walked right past. Out of the 3 areas, however, it's almost laughable just how far ahead Lanayru Desert stands when compared to Faron Woods and Elm Volcano. Its use of the time stones impacts not just the appearance of the landscape, but also puzzles, navigation, enemy placement, and does a really inventive job with this. I've touched on the best return visits to the surface, but there's definitely some stinkers here. Flooding Faron Woods was a cool premise, but this whole section is just really lame. You swim around collecting these little f***ing tadtones, and it takes way longer than it needs to. Backtracking through a temple you've already done is another example of padded out gameplay, also located in Faron Woods. It's not fun in any way, and I don't really see why it's a part of the game. This feels especially frustrating when it's followed by the really promising Elden Volcano stealth section. You get all your items taken from you, and it starts off with some really interesting environmental puzzles based around reacquiring them, but the minute you really start getting into it, you just find a chest that gives you the last chunk of your inventory all at once. Like, why did I have to spend all that time finding tadpoles? You should have just made this section longer. Something I'm on the fence about is the Spirit Realm sections. Similar to the Tadtone section, they have you performing fetch quests, but these are also stealth challenges in a weird process reminiscent of astral projection. These use the same 3 surface areas, but this time you don't have items, there's a bunch of weird phantom security guards prowling around, and the sky is dark as well as everything being cloaked in a beautiful shimmering kind of blue. You need to go around and collect spirit orbs to fill up a vessel, and if you get spotted, let your timer run out or touch water, then you'll wake up all the guardians in the area who will proceed to chase you down until you collect another spirit orb. This is fucking terrifying, and under no circumstances would I recommend letting it happen unless you enjoy the feeling of a heart attack. On one hand, reusing these layouts could be perceived as lazy design, but they're recontextualized well with a good amount of strategy put into them, which makes them enjoyable. And it's really impossible to talk about the surface without at least touching on the imprisoned. A lot of people really dislike the imprisoned and the fact that you have to fight it 3 times, and while I won't try to argue that it's good from a gameplay standpoint, I actually think it serves the narratives and themes of the game incredibly well. Avocado-like or not, it represents both the potential and inevitability of darkness rising to power. Maybe in future just spend a little longer in the concept art stage before settling on this design. The final big area of this game is the dungeons. These might be the most conventionally Zelda parts of Skyward Sword, but hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And by it, I mean a really smooth flowing series of rooms filled with puzzles, enemies, and items placed perfectly. The amount of work that goes into these things isn't really anything new for the franchise, but just about every Zelda dungeon in existence is already a masterclass in game design. So that's still really high praise. Not to mention they're incredibly paced, aesthetically immersive, and just a blast to explore. Your enjoyment of these dungeons' boss fights does hinge on your enjoyment of the motion controls at the core of Skyward Sword's design, but if you like these, then you're in for a treat. These boss fights host a lot of experimentation with motion controls, and in my opinion are all really solid. The arsenal of items you use to traverse all of this game's areas is also solid. Returning favorites like the claw shots, bow, whip, and bombs make heavy use of the motion controls for aiming, with the bombs even bringing in a really fun bowling mechanic. The slingshot is also here. New items like the mitts and the beetle bring a lot of creativity to puzzle solving and exploration. The beetle kinda uses a similar idea to Wind Waker's seagulls, whilst the mitts let you dig for treasure and explore underground crawl spaces. If I'm being honest though, I feel like they could have made more use of the mitts, and I really want to see these return sometime. These items are cool, but the ability to upgrade them all with the materials you collect really scratches that Zelda completion itch for me personally. And with it being a Zelda game, you need an instrument. That's where the Goddess Harp comes in. Honestly, I don't love this thing. It doesn't hold a candle to something like the Ocarina or the Wind Waker, and honestly, the music you play with it isn't that intuitive. You sort of just strum with the Joy-Con and it controls the pitch for you. I don't know, maybe that's how actual harps work. Any harpists, viewers of mine, let me know. If you exist, I don't know if that's a demographic I have covered, let me know. But overall, that is not my favorite part of the game. Presentation-wise, the watercolored art style of this experience has always helped it to stand out, and the HD version's upscale only makes this more apparent. It really does have a very beautiful color palette and stylized look. Sadly, the upscale only applied to the actual game itself and not the individual textures. It's not exactly in line with the above and beyond approach of Wind Waker and Twilight Princess's HD remakes, though at least it didn't cheap out on upgrading the UI textures. I also think that, as is to be expected with these sort of upscales, the polygonal shapes of certain platforms and areas have only become more apparent here. But combining the resolution upscale with the frame rate to a steady 60 ultimately makes this visually better than the Wii version. The soundtrack, meanwhile, holds up the presentation of this experience immensely with its fully orchestrated tracklist of pure quality. There's so much sonic variety that captures every experience the game throws at you, and it only ages like fine wine. The ports also made a couple of really helpful adjustments that were basically no-brainers, but across the board they're all positives. Not getting the same text when you pick up a rupee after exiting the game, thank god they fixed this. I also love that Fi isn't chiming in every 5 seconds to tell you how to play the game, but you still have the option to ask for a hint if you're stuck, only this time it's thankfully not unsolicited. She's far more tolerable in small doses, but even when she does pop up, I still find her robotic personality to be off-putting. She does feel graceful and godlike, but the drawback of that is she's pretty hard to empathize with, even though it seems like the story really wants you to. On the whole, The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD is undoubtedly the best way to experience this noteworthy Zelda entry. The upscaled visuals and retooling of several really annoying features really do lift the experience up, and when it shines, it really does shine. Unfortunately, the game, even divorced of these issues, still stands as one of the weaker entries in the Zelda franchise. It's by no means bad or even average, but it sadly still suffers from a lot of inconsistent pacing and moment-to-moment gameplay. I'd give this a 5.5 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching, I hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, please consider subscribing and hitting the bell, as well as liking and commenting any observations or thoughts you have on Skyward Sword HD or my review of it. If you didn't enjoy the review, let me know why and we can argue in the comment section, because really, I have nowhere to be. Thanks for watching.